Are you a leader that is disturbed by the insurrection that happened at our US Capitol this week, but you're unsure how to communicate with your colleagues about it? My name is Brittany Cole, and I am a speaker, coach, and the CEO of Career Thrivers Leadership Development Firm. And if you answered yes to that question, I took some time today to record this brief guide to help you navigate and initiate, as a leader, an empathy conversation with your colleagues. I hope it's helpful, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Although we know empathy is not about us, oftentimes we don't communicate that way. Empathy Conversations is a framework that I've developed to help us to center other people as the purpose in emotionally charged conversation. That connection with other people, centering others and not ourselves, is the primary way that we connect in communication. And so I want to help us with a model for how we can show up that way in conversations with our colleagues. Now, when we think about the challenges around this topic, what makes communication, particularly when we're in moments like we are right now, really challenging? It boils down to three things: emotions, timing, and competencies. Now, when we think about emotions, we're typically conditioned not to deal with our emotions, right? Emotions don't come into the workplace. Well, I would tell you that effective communication really requires emotion, and it includes three main components, right? One, our capacity to be aware of how we feel, right? That self awareness aspect of emotional intelligence, our ability then to effectively express how we feel. And then last but not least, our capability to acknowledge the emotions of others, right? So those three aspects become critical and make emotions not necessarily a challenge, but an opportunity. The second challenge that we often find in moments like this when it comes to, okay, how do I communicate? Timing becomes a really big challenge. And this is likely connected to the discomfort that we feel in having the conversation in the first place. So, what do we typically do? We delay it, we put it off, right? We wait. More time expires. Well, should I have the conversation now? It's been 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So, timing can become a really clear challenge that is directly connected to this third challenge of competency, right? Our skill set and capacity as a leader to know how to engage in these kinds of conversations. So we aren't left with this feeling of, I want to say something, but I don't know what to say. And here's why this is so important right now. The pictures that you see on the screen show two very different Americas. And so many of the emotions that your colleagues may be feeling are tied to these visuals, right? On the left-hand side, we have the visual representation of how Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House was protected during the Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd. And on the left, we have how the Capitol was not protected, and the pictures of what was an attempted coup after President Trump lost his reelection, right? And so all of this is happening this week in what, on the right hand side, is probably one of the most tragic days in American history. But many of your colleagues are reflecting back on roughly 6 months ago in the summer of 2020, seeing military police and the National Guard showing up to protect and to enforce the law. And the question becomes, where was this week? So we find ourselves oftentimes in this place of inaction. And Danielle Koch is a brilliant illustrator. She's an entrepreneur. She's a social justice activist and advocate. And she has put together what you see here, which is this cycle of inaction that we often find ourselves in moments like this, right? We see this horrible justice. We're, oh my gosh, I'm so shocked and confused. Our emotions are raging. And then we can have a tendency to fall into this space of performative allyship where we feel guilty, we feel fatigued, we feel frustrated, and we do and say nothing, right? And she's given us the antithesis of that. How do we move from apathy to action? Well, when a heroic event happens, like the one that happened at the Capitol this week, we won't be overtaken, right, by shock and confusion because we recognize that perhaps we've seen these sentiments, we've seen this kind of behavior before. And so it calls us then to embrace that emotion, right, that we oftentimes try to suppress and pretend isn't there, and to move from an emotional response to an empathetic one, which then leads us to reject this sense of performative allyship or not walking the talk, as I like to think of it, And noticing and being aware of when we feel this sense of fatigue and guilt, right? To really recenter on other people, to recenter on justice, to recenter on taking action, right? That leads to a more inclusive and equitable workplace. So if you're in the space where you're feeling like, Brittany, I know I need to say something to my team. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to address this. If you feel that this week, one, the reason why, and I don't even have a list, right? I was going to say one, two, but no. The only reason why I've taken time today to record this and share this framework is to help you with a solution. And this is a solution that I talk about in detail in my new book, Thrive Through It. It's in chapter 5, Communicating with Empathy. And I outline this framework for empathy conversations. What does it look like from a practical perspective to center other people in conversation? I want to share a brief overview with you right now. And I'm happy to engage and talk more around this topic. And so if you have a question, if you're connected with me on LinkedIn or another social media platform, or I'll share my website and email address at the end of this in just a few moments here, and we can continue the conversation. So the first thing that we want to do is focus on clarifying, right? Typically, when we think about emotional conversations or difficult conversations, right, we try to center our objective in the conversation, or we think about our I statements, right? Well, we've already said empathy isn't about us, it's about the other person. So start the conversation with a question, right? Shift from what is my primary objective to what is my first question that I'm going to ask to better understand the person that's in front of me. So here are 2 examples. How are you feeling today? What questions keep coming up to mind for you that you're working through right now? Again, before we can fully put ourselves into someone else's shoes, right, we must first understand the mindset of how the person that we're communicating with is dealing with the present change and the present loss, right? And the traumatic emotions of this week. So that's where we want to start. We want to start with inquiry. We want to start with clarifying to better understand where the person is. Here's the second step for empathy conversations. It's context. Context is all about understanding what are the external as well as internal factors that are impacting the outcome of how this person is experiencing the moment, right? And one of the things to recognize with context is that identity plays a central role in context, right? So the identity of the person that you're talking to is directly tied to how they're experiencing this moment. So asking questions or thinking about, as a leader, what else is being impacted is what the slide should say. So excuse my typo. How does this person's identity, right, impact their experience? So you want to be thinking about that as a leader to ensure that you understand the full context of the experience, recognizing that if you identify differently than the person that you're talking to, the experience, although shared, you may experience it differently than they do. All right. Here's the third step in empathy conversations. It is connection. And here's why I listed this as number 3, right? I absolutely believe 110%, right, that the point of communication is to connect. But here's where I think we oftentimes go wrong is that we lean into trying to find the connection with the person before we've done the due diligence of clarifying and understanding the context, right? You can't connect with me if you haven't taken the time to fully understand where I am. And so I believe that there's a linear aspect to this model where if you lean in first with clarifying, right? If you start from a position of inquiry and ensure that you have a better understanding of where the person is, it will help you then to make a connection that isn't about you, a connection that prioritizes the other person, right? So asking a question like, how can you, as the leader, right, support this person that you're in communication with by being what they need, not what you think they need, right? Because you haven't done the due diligence to communicate with empathy. But now that you know, right, now that you're engaged in this empathy conversation, you have a better understanding of how to be what this person specifically needs. And what this helps us with is that performative aspect that sometimes that we all fall into, right? Because we can be really wired, especially if you're high D, you're a driver, you're about the bottom line, you want to get to the result. We can be very wired to hop to the solution, right? We want to fix it. And if we, again, haven't done those first two steps, then we'll miss the mark. So we want to make sure that we connect in a meaningful way. The fourth step in empathy conversations then is the call to action, right? And our call to action comes through this connection. So again, we're not leading in the conversation with what we can do, but through these steps, right, we're able to be what the person needs to move forward and do something to support them that supports their forward movement, right? And so thinking about how can you support by being what the person needs, right? And actually communicating about that, having a conversation about what do you need this week? Is there a meeting that we can reschedule to next week? Is there a deliverable that's scheduled for this week that is important but isn't urgent? Right? Those are the kinds of practical, tactical things that you can talk about as you're having this empathy conversation. And then last but not least, as we're having empathy conversations that center the other person and not ourselves, is commitment, right? And as a leader, we want to understand, right, our people and their actions, right? And we want to make sure that our actions, right, as we better understand, our people and their feelings, right? We want to better understand how our actions can support them in the long term, right? Beyond the conversation. So, how will you support this person beyond this conversation that you are initiating as the leader to have, right? What action will you take and when will you follow up? Okay, so I hope this was helpful for you. Again, it is a solution to help you center others in communication so that we move from this space of, I haven't mentioned it this week, right? I don't have a plan to bring up what happened at the Capitol, which is probably one of the most devastating days in our nation's history because I don't know what to say, right? I don't know what to say, so I'm not going to initiate a conversation, is a self centered view, right? This is to challenge us to be empathetic, to put the needs, the experiences, the feelings of other people above ourselves, to say, I don't have to have all of the answers or the right thing to say because I'm going to lead with clarifying. I'm going to follow up to make sure I understand the context. I'm going to make a meaningful connection, and I'm going to have a call to action that isn't what I think the person needs, but that is in alignment to being what they need. And then I'm going to commit to following up and continuing my support beyond the conversation. So if this was helpful for you, I am the CEO and founder of Career Thrivers. We are a leadership development firm, and this is the work that we do, which for us is all about helping organizations cultivate a more inclusive culture so that everyone believes that they belong. And we have had the opportunity to work with some dynamic organizations that you can see here, whether it is sessions, training, course curriculum. It's been just my absolute joy and life's work to get to support companies in this way. Thank you so much for joining me. I would love for you to stay connected with me. If you'd like to pick up Thrive Through It, you can head on over to thrivethroughitbook.com. Also, that's where you can learn more about me, subscribe to our podcast, and I would love to stay connected with you. Until next time, let's thrive together.